When Thomas walked into the Blackwell Foundation's annual gala, his champagne glass nearly shattered on the marble floor. There I sat at the head table, the foundation's new chairperson, the same woman he had abandoned in a hospital recovery room 3 years earlier. Now his family's century-old fortune rested entirely in my hands, and he was simply another applicant hoping for funding. The look on his face was worth every painful moment of rehabilitation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Blackwell Foundation's annual charity gala transformed the Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall into a glittering ocean of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables adorned with arrangements of white orchids and silver candelabras. The attendees represented the upper echelon of society: old money families, tech billionaires, and philanthropic powerhouses who collectively controlled billions in charitable giving. I smoothed the silk of my emerald gown, my fingers lingering momentarily on the scar hidden beneath the fabric, a permanent reminder of the surgery that had changed everything. The diamond pendant at my throat caught the light as I surveyed the room from my position at the center of the head table, my name placard reading, Sophia James, Chairperson, in elegant gold script. The position still felt surreal some days. Even after 8 months leading the Blackwell Foundation, I occasionally expected someone to tap me on the shoulder and inform me there had been a terrible mistake. But the reality was undeniable. I now controlled the distribution of the Blackwell family's $8 billion philanthropic endowment, one of the most influential private foundations in medical research funding. My assistant leaned close, her voice barely audible above the orchestra. The Lawson Medical Research Team has arrived. They're at table 7. I nodded, maintaining my composed expression while my heart accelerated. I had known this moment would come eventually, had prepared for it methodically, yet the imminent confrontation still triggered an involuntary physiological response. "Thomas is with them?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yes. He seems unaware of your appointment. The Foundation's leadership change hasn't been publicized beyond our immediate circles." I took a measured sip of water, using the moment to center myself. "Perfect. Let's maintain that surprise a little longer." Across the room, I spotted them. The Lawson Medical Research Delegation. 5 researchers in formal attire, awkwardly navigating the social requirements of fundraising. And there, directing them toward their assigned table with practiced charm, stood Thomas Blackwell. The sight of him after 3 years sent a complex wave of emotions surging through me. Anger long tempered into resolve, hurt transformed into purpose, and beneath it all, a quiet satisfaction at the perfect symmetry the evening represented. He looked essentially unchanged, tall and distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, dark hair showing just a touch of silver at the temples, his practiced smile deployed strategically as he made introductions for his research team. The consummate physician-entrepreneur, equally comfortable in operating rooms and boardrooms. The same man who had walked out of my hospital room 3 years ago, unable to accept the reality of my diagnosis and what it might mean for his carefully planned future. The memory surfaced with unexpected vividness. The antiseptic smell of the recovery room, the persistent beep of monitors, the fog of post-anesthesia confusion, and Thomas standing at the foot of my bed, his expression a mixture of pity and detachment as he explained that he needed time to process the situation. Time that eventually extended into permanent absence, his only subsequent communication coming through lawyers who negotiated our divorce with clinical efficiency. The Foundation chairperson's welcome speech pulled me from the memory and back to the present moment. Eleanor Winthrop, the board's senior member, approached the podium with the dignified gait of someone who had navigated high society for 7 decades. "Distinguished guests, benefactors, and friends," she began, her voice carrying the refined cadence of old Boston wealth. Welcome to the Blackwell Foundation's annual Commitment Gala. For 112 years, our foundation has supported pioneering medical research that transforms lives and advances human knowledge. I watched Thomas as he listened, noting how he straightened slightly at the mention of his family name. The Blackwell legacy was a source of immense pride for him, a birthright he had always treated as an extension of his personal accomplishments, despite having done nothing to earn it beyond being born into the right family. This year marks a significant transition in our leadership, Eleanor continued. After 30 years of dedicated service, Harrison Blackwell has retired as chairperson. While the Blackwell family's extraordinary vision continues to guide our mission, we are embracing new perspective and leadership. At our table, Harrison, Thomas's uncle and my unexpected champion, reached over to squeeze my hand briefly. His eyes, still sharp at 82, conveyed both encouragement and amusement at what was about to unfold. "It is my great privilege to introduce our new chairperson," Eleanor announced. "A woman whose personal experience with medical adversity has given her unique insight into our mission, whose professional expertise in financial management has already strengthened our endowment, and whose vision will guide the Blackwell Foundation into a new era of impact and innovation." I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of hundreds of gazes shifting in my direction. From across the room, I could pinpoint the exact moment when Thomas recognized me, his confident posture faltering, champagne glass freezing halfway to his lips, eyes widening in disbelief. The glass tipped precariously, amber liquid splashing onto the pristine tablecloth as his attention fixed entirely on the impossible scene unfolding before him. "Please welcome Chairperson Sophia James," Eleanor concluded, stepping aside as applause filled the hall. The path to the podium felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous. Each step bridged not just physical distance, but the chasm between who I had been when Thomas left, a frightened patient facing an uncertain prognosis and an unwanted divorce, and who I had become, the woman now controlling his family's philanthropic legacy, and, by extension, the research funding his career depended upon. "Thank you, Eleanor, for that kind introduction," I began, my voice steady and measured. "And thank you to everyone whose commitment to medical advancement brings us together tonight." From my elevated position, I could see Thomas more clearly now. The shock on his face had transformed into careful neutrality, the same professional mask he had worn when delivering difficult news to patients, the same expression he had maintained while explaining why my diagnosis had made our marriage untenable. "My journey to this podium began in a hospital bed," I continued, watching the ripple of surprise move through the audience. Medical foundations were typically led by either physicians or financial experts, not former patients. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that required experimental treatment. That experience transformed not just my health prospects, but my understanding of what matters in medical research. I didn't look directly at Thomas as I spoke, but I could feel his gaze, intense, calculating, undoubtedly reassessing everything. He thought he knew about our shared history and his family's foundation. "Tonight, the Blackwell Foundation is announcing a significant shift in our funding priorities," I stated, delivering the announcement that would directly impact Thomas's research center. "While we will continue supporting traditional research pathways, we are substantially increasing our commitment to patient-centered research design, accessibility initiatives, and treatment protocols that prioritize quality of life alongside clinical outcomes." The implications weren't lost on anyone familiar with foundation politics. This represented a direct challenge to the research for research's sake approach that Thomas's center had long championed. Brilliant science that produced prestigious publications, but often failed to improve patient experiences in meaningful timeframes. "This evening, we will be announcing our major grant recipients for the coming year," I concluded, allowing a moment of anticipation to build. Recipients who exemplify not just scientific excellence, but a commitment to transforming how medical Advancements serve real patients with complex lives and needs. As I returned to my seat amid enthusiastic applause, I caught Harrison's approving nod. Beside him, board member Catherine Phillips leaned close to whisper, "I believe your ex-husband might require medical attention himself. He looks positively apoplectic." I permitted myself a small smile. "The evening is just beginning, Catherine. We haven't even announced the grants yet." Indeed, Thomas's research center had submitted what they considered a formality application. They had received substantial Blackwell Foundation funding for 15 consecutive years. What Thomas couldn't possibly know was that I had spent the past 6 months leading a comprehensive review of all long-standing funding relationships, implementing rigorous new criteria that prioritized patient impact over academic prestige. The dinner service began, delaying the inevitable confrontation. I ate little, maintaining pleasant conversation with board members while remaining acutely aware of Thomas watching from across the room. His research team seemed to be briefing him intensely, undoubtedly explaining who I was and speculating about how my position might affect their funding prospects. It wasn't simple revenge that had guided my actions, though I would be lying. To claim that element was entirely absent. But what had begun as a desire to reclaim power from someone who had abandoned me at my most vulnerable had evolved into something more substantial. Genuine vision for transforming medical research to better serve patients like the woman I had been 3 years ago. Scared, in pain, and treated as an interesting case study rather than a human being navigating a life-altering diagnosis. Thomas Blackwell was about to discover that his greatest mistake hadn't been leaving his wife during her medical crisis. His greatest mistake had been underestimating exactly who he had left behind and what she would become in his absence. The first course had barely been cleared when I noticed Thomas making his calculated approach. He navigated between tables with practiced social grace, pausing briefly for strategic handshakes and shoulder touches. The networking choreography he had perfected over years of medical fundraising events. Each pause brought him incrementally closer to the head table, while maintaining the appearance of casual circulation rather than determined confrontation. I monitored his progress peripherally while discussing foundation endowment strategies with Harrison and Catherine, maintaining the composed demeanor that had become my professional signature. 3 years ago, the prospect of this confrontation would have sent my anxiety spiraling. Now, I simply adjusted the timing of my planned departure from the table to intercept him in the most advantageous location, beside the historic Blackwell Foundation donor wall where generations of his family were commemorated in gold lettering. "Sophia," he said as I turned to face him, his voice carrying that precise blend of surprise and warmth he reserved for unexpected professional encounters. "This is quite a development." I met his gaze directly, noting the calculated assessment behind his initial shock. "Thomas, I trust you're enjoying the evening." "It's certainly more interesting than anticipated." His smile remained fixed while his eyes conducted a comprehensive reappraisal, taking in my position, appearance, and the respectful deference shown by Foundation staff who hovered nearby. "Chairperson of my family's foundation. That's quite a career pivot from hospital financial management." "From the James Memorial Hospital Financial Management," I corrected with subtle emphasis. "The institution your great-grandfather established, as I recall from your family history lessons. Though you always focused more on your grandfather's research legacy than the family's philanthropic origins." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A muscle twitched almost imperceptibly along his jawline, a tell I recognized from our marriage, indicating when something had penetrated his carefully maintained composure. The reference to his selective family pride had landed precisely as intended. "You've clearly been busy," he observed, his tone modulating toward the professional curiosity he typically employed with colleagues whose work warranted evaluation. "I had heard you'd made a surprisingly complete recovery. but this position represents quite a remarkable rehabilitation. The deliberate double meaning hung between us, his acknowledgement of both my medical recovery and unlikely professional ascension, wrapped in the type of backhanded compliment he had always specialized in delivering. Recovery creates perspective, Thomas. Perspective creates opportunity. I gestured toward the donor wall where the Blackwell name featured prominently. Harrison recognized that the foundation needed leadership from someone who understands both financial management and patient experience. My unique qualifications proved persuasive to the board. Harrison, Thomas repeated, the single word laden with complex family dynamics. His relationship with his uncle had always been strained. The pragmatic medical researcher versus the idealistic family patriarch with decidedly different visions for the Blackwell legacy. I wasn't aware you'd maintained contact with my uncle. We connected at the Neuroscience Innovation Conference last year. I was presenting on financial models for patient-centered research protocols. I allowed a pause for this information to register. My persistent nerve damage makes extended handshaking painful. But otherwise, the experimental treatment proved remarkably effective. His gaze flickered briefly to my hands, the same hands he had once declared would likely never regain full functionality, part of his clinical assessment that had somehow transformed into justification for dissolution of our marriage. I'm genuinely pleased for your recovery, he offered, recalibrating his approach. Though I admit to some confusion regarding the Foundation's leadership transition. The family has traditionally maintained direct control, I finished. For him, my tone pleasant, but firm. Harrison explained that tradition thoroughly during the selection process. He also emphasized how the Blackwell Foundation's original mission prioritized patient outcomes over institutional prestige, a focus that had apparently diminished in recent decades. Around us, the gala continued in full swing, attendees casting curious glances toward our conversation. Many recognized Thomas, the prominent Blackwell descendant whose research center had long enjoyed the Foundation's generous support. Fewer recognized me, the new chairperson whose appointment had been kept relatively private pending tonight's official introduction. You always did have remarkable recall for selectively useful information, Thomas observed, a faint edge entering his voice. I assume you've reviewed our center's grant application for the coming cycle? We've made significant advances in neuroplasticity research since last year's submission. And there it was, the pivot to his immediate concern. Not our shared history, not the extraordinary circumstances of our reunion, but the funding his research center depended upon, the funding that now required my approval. All applications received comprehensive review under our new evaluation framework, I replied, maintaining professional neutrality. The Grants Committee has finalized recommendations based on alignment with our adjusted priorities. The board votes tomorrow morning. Alarm flickered behind his composed expression. Adjusted priorities? The submission guidelines didn't mention significant changes to evaluation criteria. The foundational criteria remain consistent: scientific merit, investigator qualifications, institutional capabilities. I offered a smile that conveyed professional courtesy rather than personal connection. We've simply added weighted factors for patient impact timelines, accessibility considerations, and quality of life outcomes integration, elements that have always been theoretically valued but not systematically assessed. Thomas processed this information with the rapid calculation of someone recognizing a significant threat to established plans. His research center excelled at pioneering scientific exploration that generated prestigious publications and academic advancement opportunities. Patient application was always positioned as the eventual outcome, though eventual often extended decades into a hypothetical future. Those factors involve considerable subjectivity, he noted carefully. Scientific breakthrough often precedes practical application by years, sometimes decades. The Foundation has historically recognized the importance of foundational research, without premature constraints regarding implementation timelines. Historical approaches evolve, Thomas. Much like medical prognoses. I held his gaze steadily. 3 years ago, you explained with considerable authority that my condition had less than a 20% chance of substantial recovery. You presented that assessment as justification for dissolving our marriage rather than navigating an uncertain future together. Your clinical judgment regarding probabilistic outcomes proved flawed in that instance. Perhaps it's worth considering what other assessments might benefit from. Revised perspective. The calculated reference to his abandoned commitments, both marital and medical, landed precisely as intended. Color rose slightly along his neck as he maintained his professional facade through visible effort. Medical assessments are based on statistical evidence available at the time, he replied, his voice lowered to ensure privacy despite the public setting. Personal decisions involve complex factors beyond clinical prognosis. Conflating the two serves neither professional discourse nor productive resolution. On that point, we agree completely, I replied with genuine conviction. Separating evidence-based assessment from personal bias is precisely what our new evaluation framework ensures. Applications are scored on measurable criteria rather than historical relationships or institutional prestige. A server approached with champagne, providing a momentary pause in our increasingly tense exchange. I declined with a polite gesture while Thomas accepted a glass, using the interaction to recalibrate his approach. I've always respected your analytical precision, Sophia, he said after a calculated sip, his tone shifting toward collegial respect. It's clearly serving you well in this role. Perhaps we could discuss the specifics of these new evaluation criteria. My team has made substantial adjustments to our research protocols since your experience with similar neurological complications. Your insights could prove valuable for our ongoing work. The strategic pivot was vintage Thomas, reframing confrontation as collaboration, potential conflict as mutual opportunity. It had been effective throughout his career, particularly with foundation directors and hospital administrators who appreciated being approached as valued contributors rather than mere funding sources. The criteria documentation will be published next week, I replied, neither accepting nor rejecting his implied proposal for special consultation. Complete. Transparency in evaluation methodology is another of our new commitments. All applicants will have equal access to the framework details. From across the room, I caught Eleanor's subtle signal indicating the grant announcement proceedings would begin shortly. Perfect timing to conclude this initial encounter before it progressed into territory I wasn't prepared to navigate publicly. If you'll excuse me, the announcement program is about to begin, I said, professional courtesy impeccable despite the emotional undercurrents. It's been illuminating to reconnect, Thomas. As I turned to leave, he spoke once more, his voice carrying a note I hadn't heard before, something between resignation and genuine inquiry. Was this always your intention, Sophia? When Harrison approached you? I paused, considering both, the question and the complex truth behind it. When Harrison had first reached out after the neuroscience conference, revenge hadn't been my motivation for engaging with the Blackwell Foundation. My interest had been genuine, bringing patient perspective to medical research funding, transforming how innovation prioritized human outcomes alongside scientific advancement. But I couldn't honestly claim that the potential intersection with Thomas's career had been irrelevant to my decision. My intention was to ensure that patients like me have greater voice in how medical research is directed and evaluated, I answered, offering the core truth while acknowledging the personal dimension with a direct look. The fact that this path intersects with your career is mathematical probability rather than primary motivation, though I won't pretend the symmetry lacks a certain poetic justice. Thomas nodded slowly, a complex calculation visible behind his eyes. And tomorrow's grant announcements? Should my team prepare for similarly poetic outcomes? Your application was evaluated according to the same criteria as all others. I replied with perfect professional composure. The results reflect alignment with foundation priorities rather than personal history. Whether that alignment exists is something you'll discover shortly. As I walked away toward the head table, I felt Thomas's gaze following me, the weight of realization settling fully upon him. The woman he had dismissed as a compromised future had become the arbiter of his own professional prospects. The patient whose recovery he had deemed statistically improbable now controlled the funding his research center required to continue operation. More importantly, the partner he had abandoned rather than support through medical crisis now held authority to reshape the medical research landscape according to a vision he had never valued enough to understand. A vision born directly from the experience of being a patient treated as a condition rather than a complete human being navigating life-altering diagnosis. Tomorrow's grant announcements would indeed deliver a reckoning, not through vindictive denial of worthy research, but through rigorous application of principles that should have guided medical research funding all along. Principles that prioritized patients over prestige, human outcomes over institutional advancement, and transparent accountability over entrenched privilege. The true power I now possessed wasn't merely the ability to approve or deny Thomas's funding application. The true power was implementing systematic change that would transform the landscape for all medical researchers and the patients their work ultimately served. That transformation would be my most meaningful recovery of all. The grand ballroom transformed for the grant announcement ceremony. Staff efficiently rearranged tables into a semicircle facing an illuminated stage where the Foundation's legacy was displayed through a tasteful digital presentation. Historic photographs of Blackwell hospitals, laboratories, and medical breakthroughs funded throughout the decades. The Foundation's evolution appeared in chronological tribute, from Harrison Blackwell II's initial endowment in 1911 to present-day innovations. I took my position at the podium as the final montage faded, the room settling into anticipatory silence. From this elevated perspective, I could see Thomas seated with his research team, his posture professionally attentive, though tension radiated from his rigid shoulders. Beside him, Dr. Eliza Chen, his research co-director and the scientific backbone of their operation, whispered something that prompted a barely perceptible shake of his head. The team's anxiety was palpable even from a distance. For over a century, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. The Blackwell Foundation has supported medical innovation that changes lives. Tonight, we honor that legacy by announcing the recipients of this year's major research grants, investments that reflect both scientific excellence and our renewed commitment to patient-centered outcomes. The traditional announcement format had been revised under my direction. Rather than simply listing recipients and award amounts, each grant would be contextualized with specific reference to patient impact potential. This approach highlighted the values guiding our decisions while educating the broader medical community about our evolving priorities. Our first major grant recipient, I continued, is the Barrett Institute for Regenerative Medicine, awarded $2 million for their groundbreaking work on spinal cord injury recovery protocols that integrate rehabilitation technologies with patient quality of life measures. Appreciative applause followed as Dr. Amara Barrett approached the stage to accept the ceremonial grant certificate, her research center's accomplishments highlighted on the display screens. 3 more announcements followed in similar fashion, each recipient representing research that balanced scientific innovation with concrete plans for improving patient outcomes within meaningful timeframes. I could see Thomas growing increasingly tense as the ceremony progressed. Traditionally, the Lawson Medical Research Center's grant was announced early in the program due to its historical significance and consistent funding. Its absence from the initial announcement signaled a departure from precedent that wouldn't go unnoticed by anyone familiar with Foundation traditions. 4 grants announced, then 5. The Lawson Center remained unmentioned as we approached the final major award. Thomas maintained his professional composure, but his research team's expressions ranged from confusion to barely concealed alarm. They had received substantial Blackwell funding annually for 15 years. The unspoken guarantee of continued support had shaped their entire operational model and staffing structure. Our final major grant represents the Blackwell Foundation's largest single investment for the coming year, I announced, watching Thomas's attention sharpen. This $8 million award recognizes not only scientific excellence, but extraordinary commitment to translating research into accessible patient interventions within accelerated timeframes. The tension emanating from the Lawson table was almost visible, a collective held breath as they awaited confirmation of their expected funding. The Blackwell Foundation is proud to announce this landmark grant to the Chen Watkins Neurological Collaboration Initiative. The room fell momentarily silent before erupting in surprised applause. Dr. Eliza Chen's shock was evident as she turned to Thomas, clearly processing the unprecedented announcement. Not only had the grant gone to a different research initiative, but it had been awarded to a collaboration led by his own co-director in partnership with researchers from a competing institution. As Eliza rose somewhat dazedly to approach the stage, Thomas remained frozen in his seat, the full implications undoubtedly crystallizing in his analytical mind. The foundation hadn't merely reduced his center's funding, they had explicitly funded a breakaway initiative led by his own colleague, effectively endorsing a research direction he had consistently deprioritized. The Chen Watkins Initiative represents exactly the type of collaborative, patient-focused research the Blackwell Foundation is committed to supporting, I explained as Eliza reached the stage. By combining Dr. Chen's pioneering neuroplasticity techniques with Dr. Watkins's patient rehabilitation protocols, this initiative promises to bridge the traditional gap between laboratory innovation and bedside implementation. On the display screens, details of the initiative appeared, including elements I knew Thomas had specifically argued against during internal priority discussions at the Lawson Center. Eliza's approach had always emphasized accelerated clinical applications, while Thomas prioritized fundamental mechanisms that, while scientifically valuable, postponed patient benefits indefinitely. This collaboration emerged from a remarkable recognition, I continued, giving context that everyone in the medical research community would understand. When research leaders with complementary expertise prioritize patient outcomes over institutional boundaries, breakthroughs occur at the intersection of their combined knowledge. The Blackwell Foundation is proud to support research structures that place patient needs at the center of scientific collaboration. As Eliza accepted the ceremonial certificate, her professional composure couldn't entirely mask her vindication. For years, her patient-centered research priorities had been secondary to Thomas's more prestigious publication-focused approach. The Foundation's decision represented external validation of her vision and substantial independent funding to pursue it. "Thank you, Chairperson James and the entire Blackwell Foundation Board," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the evident emotion beneath her words. "This grant will allow us to implement protocols that connect laboratory discoveries directly to patient rehabilitation in timeframes that matter to people navigating neurological recovery. By integrating patient experience design throughout our research process, we believe we can transform not just outcomes, but the entire journey of neurological rehabilitation." I completed the ceremony with acknowledgement of smaller grant recipients and closing remarks about the Foundation's vision. Throughout, I maintained professional focus that revealed nothing of my personal connection to either Thomas or the neurological research being funded. To most attendees, this was simply another grant announcement cycle, albeit with some surprising shifts in recipient patterns. As the formal program concluded and guests dispersed toward the reception area for continued networking, I noticed Thomas making his way against the flow of traffic, clearly intent on reaching me before I could exit the stage. His expression remained carefully neutral, though the determination in his stride revealed the conversation's importance to him. "A moment of your time, Chairperson James?" he requested as I gathered my notes, his formality signaling his awareness of potential observers. "Of course, Dr. Blackwell," I replied with equal professionalism, stepping aside to create a semblance of privacy at the edge of the stage. May I ask what the Lawson Center's grant status is? He inquired, his tone controlled despite the existential implications of the question. I noticed we weren't among the major announcements. The Lawson Center's application received a transitional support grant of $1. $2 million, I explained, maintaining my professional demeanor. The award letter detailing the Foundation's assessment and future funding considerations will be delivered Monday morning. The impact registered immediately in his expression, $1. $2 million represented nearly an 80% reduction from their previous year's funding. Such a dramatic decrease would necessitate significant operational restructuring, potential layoffs, and radical reprioritization of research initiatives. Transitional support, he repeated, processing the terminology's implications. Meaning the Foundation is transitioning away from supporting our work entirely. The grant committee's assessment noted specific concerns regarding patient impact timelines and implementation pathways, I explained. The letter includes detailed feedback about how future applications might better align with Foundation priorities. It's not an exit from support, but a clear signal about necessary direction changes. Thomas's scientific mind rapidly calculated what this meant for his research center, his career trajectory, and his professional standing within the competitive medical research community. The man who had walked away from me in a hospital room, confidently certain of both my limited recovery prospects and his own unassailable career path, now confronted a fundamental recalibration of everything he had taken for granted. And Dr. Chen's independent initiative received full funding despite its development under the Lawson Center's umbrella, he observed, the question of loyalty implicit in his statement. Dr. Chen and Dr. Watkins submitted their application independently, with all appropriate disclosures regarding institutional affiliations, I replied evenly. The evaluation committee found their patient-centered methodology and accelerated implementation timeline exemplary in alignment with our priority framework. Around us, the gala continued, glasses clinking, conversations flowing, careers and connections being forged through the delicate social choreography of philanthropic networking. Yet in our small pocket of space, a profound reckoning was occurring, not just for Thomas personally, but for the paradigm his approach represented. This is about more than grant allocations, he said finally, his voice quieter now, the personal dimension emerging despite his efforts to maintain professional framing. This is systematic redirection of the entire research landscape. Yes, I acknowledged simply. It is. Because of what happened to you, he added, a statement rather than question. Because of what happens to thousands of patients every day, I corrected, though I didn't deny the personal catalyst. My experience opened my eyes to systemic failures in how medical research prioritizes institutional advancement over patient outcomes. The Foundation's new direction reflects recognition that those priorities require fundamental rebalancing, not incremental adjustment. Thomas studied me with the intense evaluation I recognized from our years together, the look that preceded his most important professional decisions. You're using the Foundation to implement a vision of medical research that you believe would have better served your needs as a patient. I'm leading the Foundation in implementing a vision that better serves all patients, I clarified, including accelerating the translation of breakthrough science into actual human benefit. Your work remains scientifically valuable, Thomas. The Foundation is simply requiring clearer connection between that value and measurable patient outcomes. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, something between recognition and reassessment. You always did have remarkable clarity once you identified a systemic problem, he observed, the comment hovering between compliment and concession. Perspective often emerges from experiencing systems from positions we didn't choose, I replied. 3 years ago, I didn't choose to become a patient navigating neurological recovery alone, But that experience revealed structural problems invisible from more privileged vantage points. For a moment, I glimpsed something unexpected in his expression. A flicker of genuine regret quickly submerged beneath his practiced professional composure. Whether it was regret for his personal choices or simply recognition of strategic miscalculation remained impossible to discern. The restructuring this creates for the Lawson Center will be significant, he said finally, returning to practical implications. Jobs will be affected, research trajectories interrupted. Change always creates disruption, I acknowledged. The Foundation's transitional funding is designed to support responsible adaptation rather than abrupt cessation. The detailed feedback provides clear pathway for future alignment, should you choose to pursue it. The unspoken question hung between us, whether his pride would permit such adaptation or whether he would resist what he might perceive as capitulation to my vision. 3 years ago, I would have predicted the latter with certainty. Now, seeing subtle shifts in his assessment of the situation, I recognized that transformative pressure sometimes catalyzes unexpected evolution. We should continue this conversation in a more appropriate setting, he suggested, gesturing toward the increasingly curious observers noting our extended exchange. Perhaps a meeting next week to discuss transition strategies? My office would be suitable, I agreed, appreciating the professionalism of his pivot despite the undoubtedly painful recalibration occurring behind it. My assistant can arrange a time that works with your schedule. As he nodded and turned to rejoin his research team, I watched the straight-back determination in his stride, the physical embodiment of a man who had built his identity around certainty now navigating fundamental uncertainty. There was no satisfaction in witnessing his professional challenge, despite our personal history. The Foundation's evolving priorities weren't designed to diminish individual careers, but to elevate collective purpose, reconnecting medical research to its ultimate human impact. What I felt instead was the quiet validation of transformation, not just my personal journey from patient to philanthropic leader, but the broader transformation of systems that had too long privileged institutional prestige over human experience. The true measure of that transformation wouldn't be Thomas's individual response, but the collective shift in how medical research balanced scientific advancement with patient benefit. That balance represented the future I had nearly lost hope of seeing during my darkest days of recovery. A future where medical innovation served human lives in time frames that mattered to those lives. Making that future reality was worth every difficult conversation, every challenging decision, and every moment of confronting painful history. The power to direct the Blackwell fortune toward that vision wasn't about controlling Thomas's prospects. It was about ensuring that patients like the woman I had been 3 years ago would navigate very different experiences in years to come. That was victory far more meaningful than any personal vindication could ever be. Monday morning arrived, with a crystalline clarity that belied the complex emotional undercurrents flowing beneath the surface of my professional life. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight illuminated the Blackwell Foundation's executive office, a space redesigned under my direction to balance the gravitas of century-old philanthropy with contemporary transparency. Gone were the heavy, mahogany furnishings and oil portraits of Blackwell patriarchs that had previously dominated the room, replaced by a balanced aesthetic of historical acknowledgement and forward-looking purpose. At precisely 9 a.m., my assistant announced Thomas's arrival. He entered with characteristic punctuality, his bearing professionally composed despite what must have been a weekend of significant turmoil. The grant announcements at Friday's gala had created seismic disruption throughout the medical research community, with the Lawson Center's funding reduction generating particular speculation, given Thomas's family connection to the foundation. "Good morning, Sophia," he greeted me, accepting my gesture toward the conference table rather than the more intimate seating arrangement near the windows. The choice of setting established our interaction firmly in the professional realm, exactly where boundaries were most clearly defined. "Thank you for meeting so promptly," I replied, taking my seat across from him. "I imagine the weekend involved considerable strategic reassessment for your team." "That would be a significant understatement," he acknowledged with surprising candor. "The funding reduction creates immediate operational challenges and longer-term strategic questions that require comprehensive recalibration." On the table between us lay two folders, one containing the official grant notification with detailed committee feedback, the other holding my personal notes regarding the conversation I anticipated. Thomas's gaze registered the folders with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to extracting critical information from subtle indicators. "I've reviewed the formal feedback documentation," he said, gesturing toward the folders. "The concerns regarding patient impact timelines and implementation pathways were quite specific. Surprisingly specific, in fact." I noted the implication in his observation without addressing it directly. The Foundation's new evaluation framework includes standardized assessment categories developed in consultation with both research leaders and patient advocacy organizations. All applications received equally detailed feedback. Thomas nodded, accepting this explanation while clearly harboring deeper questions about the process. The Chen Watkins Initiative received extraordinary endorsement within this framework. Their approach must have aligned remarkably well with these new priorities. Their application demonstrated exceptional integration of scientific advancement with patient-centered implementation, I confirmed. Particularly their timeline for translating laboratory findings into rehabilitation protocols accessible within meaningful patient timeframes. "Eliza has always emphasized accelerated implementation," Thomas acknowledged, a hint of new perspective in his tone. "It's an approach I considered occasionally premature, potentially sacrificing comprehensive understanding for expedited application. A philosophical difference with significant implications for patients navigating recovery within the constraints of human lifespans," I observed, maintaining professional composure despite the personal significance of this distinction. My own recovery had occurred through precisely the type of accelerated implementation protocols Thomas had historically deemed premature. He studied me with renewed evaluation, as if seeing dimensions previously invisible. "You've established a framework that systematically privileges her philosophy over mine, not just regarding our specific neurological research, but across the entire spectrum of medical innovation the Foundation funds. The framework privileges patient outcomes within meaningful timeframes," I corrected gently. "That this aligns with Dr. Chen's approach rather than yours, reflects philosophical alignment rather than personal preference." Thomas was silent for a moment, his analytical mind visibly processing multiple dimensions simultaneously. When he spoke again, his tone carried unexpected openness beneath its professional restraint. "I've spent the weekend reviewing our research center's trajectory over the past decade," he said, opening a slim portfolio he'd brought with him. "Comparing publication impact, citation metrics, and advancement of fundamental understanding against actual implementation of findings in clinical settings." This disclosure surprised me. I had anticipated defense of his established approach rather than evidence of reflective assessment. "The metrics are unbalanced in precisely the direction your feedback indicated," he continued, displaying a graph that starkly visualized the disparity. "Our scientific contributions to the field have been substantial, while our translation of those contributions into patient interventions has been significantly delayed." The admission carried weight beyond its factual content. It represented a fundamental reconsideration of priorities Thomas had defended throughout his career. His willingness to acknowledge this imbalance suggested a depth of reflection I hadn't anticipated. "Recognition of systemic imbalance is the first step toward meaningful recalibration," I observed, careful to respond to the professional insight rather than its personal implications. "Which brings me to the purpose of this meeting," Thomas said, straightening slightly as he transitioned to the central subject. I'm not here merely to discuss the grant reduction, but to present a counter-proposal that addresses the Foundation's concerns while leveraging the Lawson Center's established capabilities. He placed a bound document on the table between us. Substantial. Enough to represent significant work completed over the weekend, yet professionally presented with characteristic attention to detail. This restructuring proposal integrates the Foundation's patient-centered priorities while maintaining our core research strengths, he explained, opening the document to an executive summary. Rather than simply adapting existing projects to new evaluation criteria, we've developed a fundamentally redesigned approach to how our center connects research activities to implementation pathways. I accepted the document with measured interest, noting the comprehensive scope as I reviewed the summary. The proposal outlined substantial organizational redesign, creating dedicated implementation teams paired with research divisions, establishing patient advisory councils with meaningful influence over research priorities, and developing accelerated pathways for translating promising findings into clinical applications. This represents significant structural transformation, I observed, genuine professional appreciation in my tone. Particularly the integration of patient advisory influence throughout the research process, rather than merely at evaluation stages. The concept emerged from reconsidering a perspective you once shared that I admittedly dismissed, Thomas replied, surprising me with this reference to our personal history. During your initial diagnosis, you emphasized that patients measure medical advancement not by statistical significance, but by tangible impact within the time frame of their individual journey. The memory surfaced with unexpected clarity, a conversation in our kitchen 3 years ago, my hands trembling with the early symptoms of my condition as I tried to explain why abstract research timelines felt disconnected from my immediate reality as a newly diagnosed patient. Thomas had listened with clinical detachment, explaining why patient perception couldn't drive scientific methodology without compromising research integrity. I remember the conversation, I acknowledged, maintaining professional composure despite the emotional resonance, though I wouldn't have expected it to influence your current thinking. It should have, he said simply, the admission carrying weight beyond its brevity. Just as other perspectives I dismissed should have informed our research center's approach long before external pressure necessitated reconsideration. The implication hung between us. Acknowledgement that his dismissal of my perspective extended beyond our personal relationship into his professional framework, with consequences for both domains. The proposal includes substantial operational reorganization, he continued, returning to professional terrain with visible effort. Including leadership reconfiguration that elevates Dr. Chen to co-equal executive authority while establishing a new patient impact division with dedicated staff and resources. I continued reviewing the document, noting the comprehensive nature of the proposed transformation. This wasn't merely cosmetic adjustment designed to secure renewed funding, but fundamental reconceptualization of how the Lawson Center approached its scientific mission. The changes would directly address the specific concerns highlighted in the Foundation's evaluation, while maintaining the center's research strengths. Implementation timeline? I inquired, turning to the relevant section. Initial reorganization within 60 days. Complete structural transformation within 6 months, Thomas replied without hesitation. We've already initiated discussions with our research staff and institutional leadership to ensure feasibility of the proposed timeline. The rapid implementation schedule reflected serious commitment rather than theoretical consideration, evidence that Thomas had spent the weekend in substantive planning rather than merely developing a persuasive proposal. I recognized the characteristic intensity he brought to challenges once he committed to addressing them. What does this restructuring mean for your personal role? I asked, identifying the question fundamental to assessing the proposal's viability. Organizational transformation required authentic leadership commitment, particularly from established figures whose historical approach was being fundamentally revised. Thomas met my gaze directly, his response measured yet candid. It means acknowledging that my vision for the center, while scientifically productive, has created systematic imbalance between knowledge advancement and patient benefit. Addressing that imbalance requires not just structural reorganization, but leadership evolution. He paused briefly before continuing with remarkable directness. In practical terms, it means transitioning from sole executive authority to shared leadership with Eliza, whose perspective on patient impact timelines clearly aligns better with foundation priorities and indeed with patient needs. It means establishing accountability structures that prevent reverting to comfortable patterns once funding pressure diminishes. The acknowledgement represented extraordinary evolution for someone whose professional identity had been built around unquestioned authority and singular vision. Whether catalyzed by funding necessity or genuine perspective shift, the commitment to structural change that constrained his own authority demonstrated unexpected adaptability. The proposal appears comprehensive and thoughtfully constructed, I observed, closing the document after completing my initial review. Implementation of these changes would substantially address the specific concerns identified in the Foundation's evaluation framework. Then the Foundation would consider restoring the Lawson Center's previous funding level? Thomas asked, the question direct, yet appropriately framed as inquiry rather than presumption. The proposal warrants serious consideration for supplemental funding beyond the transitional grant already awarded, I replied carefully. However, Foundation protocols require formal submission for committee evaluation rather than discretionary allocation, even when the proposal addresses previous concerns. Thomas nodded, accepting this procedural requirement without objection. We anticipated that necessity. The formal submission package is being finalized today, with addition of specific metrics and accountability mechanisms beyond those outlined in this executive overview. His acceptance of procedural requirements represented another subtle shift, respecting Foundation governance rather than expecting exceptional treatment based on historical relationship or family connection. This, too, suggested evolution beyond the entitlement that had previously characterized his approach to institutional relationships. May I ask a direct question? He said after a moment, his tone shifting toward careful inquiry. Of course. Is this restructuring proposal being evaluated by the woman I abandoned during medical crisis, or the Foundation chairperson responsible for strategic philanthropic direction? The question's directness momentarily disrupted my professional composure. It acknowledged the dual nature of our interaction with unprecedented candor, neither pretending the personal dimension didn't exist, nor using it to manipulate the professional exchange. The proposal will be evaluated according to established Foundation criteria by the full Grants Committee, I replied after brief consideration. My role as chairperson includes ensuring that evaluation adheres to objective standards rather than personal history, whether that history might prejudice against or favor the application. Thomas nodded, accepting this boundary as appropriate, rather than challenging it as he might have previously. That's exactly what I would expect from you, both professionally and personally. Your integrity was never the dimension I failed to appreciate. The observation carried acknowledgement I hadn't anticipated, recognition of qualities he had once taken for granted or dismissed as obstacles to expediency. Whether this represented genuine evolution in his perception or strategic adaptation to changed power dynamics remained impossible to determine with certainty. The Foundation's mission transcends any individual relationship, I noted, returning to the professional core of our interaction. Its purpose is ensuring that medical research serves patient needs effectively, regardless of personal connections or institutional histories. A purpose I'm beginning to understand more clearly through forced reconsideration of established assumptions, Thomas acknowledged. Though I recognize the irony that this clarity arrives through circumstances neither of us would have anticipated 3 years ago. Indeed, The scene would have been unimaginable during my hospital recovery. The woman struggling through rehabilitation exercises now evaluating research funding proposals from the man who had deemed her prognosis too limiting to warrant continued partnership. The reversal contained undeniable poetic dimension without requiring active orchestration. Life rarely follows anticipated trajectories, I observed, the understatement intentional in its restraint. Our greatest growth often emerges from navigating unexpected paths rather than pursuing predetermined destinations. As Thomas gathered his materials in preparation to leave, I noted subtle changes in his demeanor, a measured thoughtfulness replacing the confident certainty that had once defined his professional presence. Whether this transformation reflected genuine perspective shift or merely strategic adaptation remained to be seen through implementation rather than proposal. "Thank you for considering our restructuring approach," he said, rising to depart. Whatever the committee's determination regarding funding, this recalibration process has revealed institutional imbalances requiring correction regardless of financial implications. That recognition may ultimately prove more valuable than any grant allocation, I observed, walking him to the door with professional courtesy. Systemic transformation begins with acknowledging existing limitations rather than defending established patterns. As the door closed behind him, I returned to my desk, contemplating the unexpected dimensions of our interaction. The proposal's comprehensive nature suggested Thomas had spent the weekend engaged in fundamental reassessment rather than merely developing a strategy to recover lost funding. Whether this reassessment extended beyond professional framework into personal recognition remained unclear, and ultimately less relevant than the systemic changes it might produce. The true measure of transformation wasn't words on paper, but sustained commitment to implementation when pressure diminished. Only time would reveal whether today's proposal represented genuine evolution or sophisticated adaptation to temporary constraint. Either way, the patients who might benefit from accelerated implementation of the Lawson Center's research would experience real impact regardless of the motivations driving institutional change. And that patient-centered impact, rather than personal vindication or professional authority, remained the ultimate purpose guiding both the Foundation's evolution and my own unexpected journey from hospital bed to philanthropic leadership. 3 weeks after Thomas submitted the restructuring proposal, I found myself visiting the Lawson Medical Research Center for the first time since my diagnosis. The Foundation's Grants Committee had approved supplemental funding contingent upon verified implementation of the proposed changes, and today's site visit would establish baseline metrics for ongoing evaluation. The research center occupied 4 floors of a gleaming building on the university medical campus. I had visited countless times during my marriage to Thomas, attending fundraising events and social gatherings where his research accomplishments were celebrated among peers and potential donors. Those visits had positioned me as the supportive spouse, admiring his work from a respectful distance. Today, I entered as the Foundation chairperson whose evaluation would influence the center's future direction and financial viability. The transformation was already visible in the lobby, where a newly installed interactive display highlighted research to recovery pathways, visual representations connecting ongoing research projects to potential patient applications with estimated implementation timelines. The traditional wall of scientific publications and academic honors remained, but now shared equal prominence with patient impact metrics and implementation milestones. Chairperson James, Dr. Eliza Chen greeted me, extending her hand with professional warmth. "Thank you for coming personally to review our progress." Eliza had always been the brilliant scientific counterbalance to Thomas's administrative authority at the center, the innovative researcher whose patient-centered instincts had often been constrained by institutional priorities she couldn't unilaterally change. Now, with her elevation to co-director and the Foundation's explicit endorsement of her approach, she moved with the confident purpose of someone finally empowered to implement long-held vision. The Foundation appreciates your leadership in this restructuring initiative, I replied, genuinely impressed by the visible changes already implemented in the short time since proposal approval. The transformation appears to be progressing rapidly. With surprising momentum, she confirmed as we walked toward the conference room where the full leadership team waited. What began as necessary response to funding reduction has catalyzed philosophical shifts that were long overdue. The team has embraced changes with remarkable enthusiasm once institutional permission was granted. The observation carried significant insight about organizational transformation, how structural changes often released latent energy constrained by previous limitations rather than requiring the imposition of unwelcome new direction. Many researchers had apparently been waiting for permission to pursue precisely the patient-centered approaches now being prioritized. In the conference room, a diverse team awaited our arrival: research directors, implementation specialists, and most notably, patient advisory representatives now integrated into the center's leadership structure. Thomas sat at the head of the table, rising as we entered with professional composure that revealed nothing of any personal discomfort he might feel at my official evaluation of his domain. Chairperson James, welcome to the Lawson Center, he greeted me with appropriate formality. We've prepared a comprehensive progress report on restructuring implementation, with particular emphasis on the metrics established in our supplemental funding agreement. The meeting proceeded with remarkable efficiency, each department representative presenting specific changes implemented, challenges encountered, and metrics established for ongoing evaluation. The presentations reflected genuine engagement rather than performative compliance. These were scientists and administrators who had embraced the restructuring as valuable evolution rather than merely necessary accommodation to funding requirements. Most striking was the new Patient Impact Division, led by Dr. Maya Washington, a rehabilitation specialist with extensive experience translating research findings into clinical applications. This entirely new department served as the bridge between research teams and clinical implementation, with organizational authority to influence research priorities based on patient benefit potential. Our division evaluates research initiatives at conception rather than completion, Dr. Washington explained, displaying a sophisticated assessment framework on the presentation screen. This allows us to identify implementation pathways for promising findings before research design becomes fixed in ways that might limit practical application. The approach directly addressed a core problem in traditional research structures: the tendency to pursue scientifically interesting questions without clear pathways for translating findings into patient benefit. By integrating implementation, consideration from inception, the center was fundamentally reshaping how research questions were formulated and pursued. Throughout the presentations, I observed Thomas with professional attention. He contributed at appropriate intervals, demonstrating clear command of the restructuring details and genuine commitment to implementation. More notable, however, was his willingness to yield authority to others, deferring to Eliza on scientific direction, to Dr. Washington on implementation priorities, and to patient advisors on experience considerations. This represented profound evolution for someone whose leadership style had historically centralized decision-making authority. Whether this evolution reflected genuine perspective shift or strategic adaptation remained impossible to determine with certainty, but the operational impact was the same regardless of motivation. After the formal presentations concluded, Thomas suggested a tour of the laboratories to observe restructuring impacts in practical research environments. As we moved through the facility, researchers demonstrated how their work had been reoriented to connect more directly with patient applications, often with enthusiasm that suggested liberation rather than constraint. Dr. Levine's team has completely reconfigured their neural imaging protocols based on patient advisory input, Eliza explained as we observed a laboratory where researchers collaborated with a former patient now serving as consultant. The changes have actually accelerated data collection while making the experience significantly less stressful for participants. The patient perspective identified unnecessary procedural elements that researchers had maintained out of habit, rather than scientific necessity, Thomas added, the observation revealing newfound appreciation for input his previous approach would have categorized as non-scientific interference. As the tour continued, I noticed subtle but significant changes in physical spaces. Research areas now included visualization of patient impact goals alongside technical objectives. Collaboration zones connected previously separated teams working on related aspects of implementation pathways, and most notably, dedicated spaces where patient advisors could observe and contribute to research activities. The environmental modifications reflect philosophical evolution beyond procedural changes, Thomas noted, recognizing my attention to these details. Physical space influences cognitive frameworks in ways we hadn't fully appreciated. Restructuring. The environment helps reshape how researchers conceptualize their work's purpose and priorities. The insight suggested deeper engagement with transformation principles than mere procedural compliance would require, evidence that Thomas was intellectually exploring implications beyond minimum requirements for funding restoration. His scientific mind, once applied primarily to research questions, now seemed engaged with the systematic challenge of institutional transformation itself. After completing the comprehensive tour, Thomas suggested continuing our discussion in his office while the Foundation team reviewed additional documentation with department leaders. The proposal carried professional appropriateness while creating opportunity for more direct conversation about the restructuring's progress. His office had transformed along with the broader institution. Gone was the imposing desk that had previously dominated the space, replaced by a more collaborative arrangement that reduced physical barriers between Thomas and those entering his workspace. The walls, once covered exclusively with academic accolades and scientific publication covers, now balanced these professional achievements with visual representations of research impact and patient recovery pathways. The physical changes reflect evolving priorities, he acknowledged, noting my observation of the transformed environment. Though I recognize they might appear performative, if not accompanied by deeper philosophical adjustment. Environmental. Alignment with stated values creates cognitive consistency, I replied, appreciating his awareness of potential skepticism. The Foundation will evaluate implementation through measurable outcomes rather than environmental signaling. But the comprehensive integration suggests authentic commitment rather than superficial compliance. Thomas nodded, accepting this assessment without defensiveness. The restructuring began as necessary response to funding pressure, he acknowledged with unexpected candor. But implementation has revealed possibilities beyond financial necessity, opportunities to reconnect. Scientific advancement with human impact in ways I had intellectually dismissed as compromising research integrity. The admission carried significant weight, acknowledgement that his previous approach had unnecessarily separated scientific advancement from human application through false dichotomy, rather than necessary distinction. This recognition suggested evolution beyond strategic adaptation into genuine reassessment of fundamental assumptions. The patient advisory integration has proven particularly transformative, he continued, indicating a research implementation timeline prominently displayed on his wall. Their perspectives identified unnecessary delays between discovery and application that scientific convention had normalized without valid justification. We've accelerated multiple projects without compromising methodological rigor simply by challenging assumptions about necessary sequential progression. I studied the timeline with professional interest, noting specific acceleration points where patient perspective had influenced research workflow. The modifications appeared scientifically sound while significantly reducing time between discovery and potential clinical application, precisely the balance the Foundation's new priorities sought to promote. The implementation metrics are impressive, I acknowledged, genuine appreciation in my tone. Particularly the reduction in research-to-application intervals without corresponding reduction in methodological validity. the assumption that rigor requires delay proved scientifically unfounded when subjected to actual analysis rather than conventional acceptance, Thomas observed, a note of self-critique evident in his reflection. A cognitive error I should have identified far earlier given my commitment to evidence-based methodologies in other contexts. The observation approached territory where professional reassessment intersected with personal implications, though Thomas maintained careful focus on institutional rather than relational dimensions. Whether this boundary reflected appropriate professional restraint or deliberate avoidance remained unclear. Restructuring complex systems inevitably reveals interconnected assumptions that perpetuate established patterns, I offered, keeping the exchange in productive professional territory. The Foundation's evaluation framework is designed to accelerate precisely this type of assumption testing across the broader research landscape. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression suggesting internal calculation regarding boundaries appropriate to our current interaction. When he spoke again, his tone carried careful consideration beneath its professional composure. I've been reflecting on parallel patterns between institutional and personal frameworks, he said, the observation bridging professional analysis and personal implication without directly referencing our specific history. How readily we defend established approaches based on theoretical justifications rather than outcome evaluation. How perspectives we dismiss as insufficiently informed often reveal limitations in our own understanding rather than theirs. The statement approached acknowledgement of broader patterns that had manifested in both his professional methodology and personal choices without inappropriately personalizing our professional interaction. This capacity for nuanced connection without boundary violation suggested emotional intelligence I hadn't previously associated with his typically compartmentalized approach. Systemic transformation often begins with recognizing patterns previously invisible from established vantage points, I observed, acknowledging the insight while maintaining appropriate professional framing. The Foundation's evolution reflects similar recognition regarding medical research priorities more broadly. Thomas nodded, accepting this repositioning to institutional rather than personal territory. The Center's supplement funding proposal will include comprehensive metrics documenting both implementation progress and patient impact acceleration, he noted, returning to the specific professional purpose underlying my visit. The team has established baseline measurements exceeding the preliminary requirements outlined in the conditional approval. The Foundation appreciates this commitment to measurable evaluation, I replied, gathering my materials in preparation to rejoin the broader assessment team. Transparent accountability represents essential foundation for sustainable transformation beyond initial restructuring. As we prepared to leave his office, Thomas paused briefly, his expression suggesting carefully considered purpose rather than impulsive addition. I submitted a personal reflection paper to the Medical Leadership Journal last week, he said, the information offered as professional courtesy rather than expectation. Examining how conventional research prioritization systematically devalued patient experience metrics and implementation timelines through structural biases masked as methodological necessity. The disclosure carried significance beyond its factual content. Thomas had built his reputation on defending traditional research paradigms against what he had previously characterized as emotional pressure to accelerate implementation at the expense of scientific validity. Publishing critical analysis of those same paradigms represented public commitment to perspective evolution rather than merely private accommodation to funding requirements. That contribution to professional discourse will undoubtedly advance important conversations within the research community, I acknowledged, recognizing the significance without overemphasizing personal dimensions. Systemic change requires both structural implementation and conceptual evolution across leadership networks. As we rejoined the Foundation assessment team for concluding discussions, I observed the Lawson Center's transformation with professional appreciation that transcended personal history. The restructuring Thomas had initiated, however catalyzed, by funding necessity, was creating meaningful evolution in how medical research connected to patient benefit. Researchers previously constrained by institutional priorities now pursued innovative implementation pathways with enthusiasm liberated by structural permission and resource allocation. Whether Thomas's participation in this transformation reflected genuine perspective evolution or sophisticated adaptation to changed circumstances remained secondary to the tangible outcomes being generated. Patients navigating neurological recovery would experience accelerated benefit from research breakthroughs regardless of the personal motivations driving institutional change. The accountability metrics established through the Foundation's conditional funding would ensure sustained implementation beyond initial restructuring. As chairperson of the Blackwell Foundation, my responsibility transcended personal vindication to focus on systematic transformation of medical research priorities. The evaluation framework I had helped establish was catalyzing precisely such transformation, not just at the Lawson Center, but across dozens of research institutions responding to evolving funding priorities. That broader impact represented success far more meaningful than any personal reckoning could provide, creating systems where future patients would navigate recovery journeys supported by research structures fundamentally oriented toward their needs rather than institutional prestige or professional advancement. The unexpected alliance between Thomas's administrative capability and the Foundation's evolving priorities demonstrated how transformation often emerges through pathways no one could have anticipated, including the profound restructuring of a research center catalyzed by the very person who had once dismissed patient-centered approaches as methodologically compromised. The irony contained no small measure of poetic justice, but its significance extended far beyond personal narrative into systematic change that would benefit countless patients whose names and stories we would never know. That anonymous impact represented the most meaningful measure of successful transformation. 6 months after the Lawson Center's restructuring began, the Blackwell Foundation hosted its mid-year Medical Innovation Summit, an exclusive gathering where grant recipients shared progress updates and collaborative opportunities. Historically held in academic conference centers with an atmosphere of scholarly formality, I had repositioned the summit as a bridge between research communities and patient advocacy organizations, relocating it to the glass-walled Blackwell Innovation Center overlooking Central Park. The redesigned format exemplified the Foundation's evolved priorities. Research presentations now paired directly with patient impact assessments. Implementation timelines received equal emphasis alongside scientific methodology, and each session included patient perspective speakers with equal platform to research leaders. The physical space reinforced these priorities with collaborative seating arrangements replacing traditional lecture configurations, and interactive displays allowing attendees to explore the human impact dimensions of featured research. I surveyed the gathering from a quiet mezzanine overlook, taking a moment alone before joining the opening session. The attendee composition had transformed significantly. Alongside distinguished research directors and institutional leaders stood rehabilitation specialists, patient advocacy directors, and implementation experts previously excluded from these exclusive gatherings. Quite the paradigm shift from last year's summit, Harrison Blackwell observed, joining me at the railing. At 82, Thomas's uncle maintained remarkable vitality and perceptiveness, his strategic vision for the Foundation's evolution providing crucial support for the changes I had implemented. The integration still meets occasional resistance, I acknowledged, nodding toward a cluster of traditional research directors engaged in animated conversation that suggested philosophical debate, rather than casual exchange. Several institutions continue viewing patient-centered accountability as constraint rather than enhancement. Paradigm shifts always generate resistance, Harrison replied with the perspective of someone who had witnessed numerous transformations throughout his long career. But the momentum has clearly shifted. Look there. He indicated another group where researchers and patient advocates collaborated around an interactive display. And there. pointing toward a session where implementation specialists and laboratory directors mapped accelerated pathways together. He was right. Despite pockets of resistance, the summit vibrated with collaborative energy previously absent from these gatherings. Specialists who had traditionally operated in separate domains now engaged across boundaries, creating connections that promised accelerated translation of research into meaningful patient applications. The Lawson Center delegation appears particularly engaged in the new format, Harrison noted with subtle emphasis, directing my attention to where Thomas and Eliza co-led a roundtable discussion on restructuring research priorities around implementation timelines. Indeed, the Lawson team had positioned themselves as unexpected champions of the patient-centered approach they had initially restructured out of funding necessity. Their supplemental grant application had been approved 3 months earlier based on exceptional implementation metrics that exceeded foundation requirements. Now they were sharing their transformation process with other institutions navigating similar evolution. Their restructuring has proven more substantial than even the most optimistic projections suggested, I confirmed, professional assessment transcending personal history. The 6-month progress metrics show 38% reduction in discovery to implementation, intervals while maintaining methodological validity standards. Thomas seems to have embraced the transformation with surprising commitment, Harrison observed, the comment carefully neutral despite his awareness of our personal history. His recent publication analyzing institutional barriers to patient-centered research has generated significant discourse throughout the medical research community. The article Harrison referenced had indeed created noteworthy impact, a comprehensive analysis of how traditional research structures systematically privileged academic advancement over patient benefit through structural mechanisms disguised as methodological requirements. Coming from someone who had previously defended those very structures, the critique carried particular credibility that accelerated conversation throughout the field. The analysis demonstrates sophisticated understanding of systemic barriers beyond mere procedural adjustments, I acknowledged, giving appropriate professional recognition to the contribution. The Foundation's upcoming white paper will reference it as exemplary framework for institutional self-assessment. As we prepared to join the summit's opening session, I noted Thomas glancing in our direction, his expression suggesting recognition of the conversation's probable subject without revealing particular reaction. The professional distance we maintained in public settings reflected appropriate boundaries rather than personal avoidance. Our interactions consistently focused on measurable outcomes and institutional transformation rather than historical connection. The opening session began with my welcome address highlighting the summit's evolved purpose, connecting research excellence with implementation acceleration to serve patients within meaningful timeframes. Standing at the podium overlooking representatives from every major medical research institution in the country, I experienced momentary appreciation for the extraordinary position I now occupied, directing the conversation that would shape medical research priorities affecting countless patients beyond my individual experience. The Blackwell Foundation has historically supported scientific excellence, I began, acknowledging the institutional legacy while framing its evolution. That commitment remains unwavering. What has evolved is our understanding of how excellence must be measured, not merely through publications and citations, but through tangible impact on patient lives within timeframes that matter to those navigating medical challenges. Around the room, I noted varying reactions, enthusiastic engagement from those already aligned with this vision, thoughtful consideration from those reassessing established approaches, and careful neutrality from traditional purists still viewing patient-centered accountability as potential compromise to scientific integrity. The institutions represented in this room collectively shape how medical discovery translates into human benefit, I continued. The structures, priorities, and evaluation metrics you establish determine whether breakthrough remains academic accomplishment or becomes life-changing intervention for patients awaiting solutions. The Foundation's evolved funding priorities aim to accelerate that translation not by compromising scientific rigor, but by questioning unnecessary delays between discovery and application. Following my introduction, the program transitioned to featured presentations where grant recipients shared transformation journeys similar to the Lawson Center's evolution. Research institutions recalibrating priorities to balance scientific advancement with implementation acceleration. Each presentation paired research leaders with patient impact specialists, demonstrating collaborative approaches previously rare in traditional research structures. The Lawson Center's presentation came midway through the morning session, with Thomas and Eliza co-presenting their restructuring process alongside Dr. Washington from the newly established Patient Impact Division. Their presentation highlighted specific mechanisms they had implemented to connect research activities directly with implementation pathways, structural changes that systematically integrated patient benefit considerations throughout the research process rather than treating application as separate afterthought. Our restructuring began as response to evolved funding requirements, Thomas acknowledged with candor that earned audience appreciation. But implementation revealed opportunities beyond compliance, the possibility of enhancing research impact, while maintaining methodological integrity through systematic integration of patient-centered priorities. He displayed comparative metrics demonstrating how their restructured approach had accelerated implementation timelines while maintaining scientific validity standards, evidence that patient benefit and research excellence represented complementary, rather than competing priorities when properly integrated. Perhaps most significantly, Eliza added, building on Thomas's foundation, researchers report increased motivation and purpose connection when they regularly engage with the potential human impact of their work rather than exclusively focusing on methodological processes. Scientific creativity flourishes when connected to meaningful purpose beyond academic accomplishment. Dr. Washington completed their presentation by highlighting specific examples where patient advisory input had identified implementation barriers, invisible from researcher perspective, seemingly minor procedural elements that significantly impacted patient experience without scientific justification for their maintenance. By modifying these elements based on patient feedback, they had created interventions simultaneously more effective and more accessible. Throughout their presentation, I observed Thomas with professional interest, noting the authentic engagement evident in his explanation of transformed priorities. Whether catalyzed initially by funding necessity or genuine perspective shift, his current commitment to patient-centered research methodology appeared substantially integrated into his professional identity rather than merely strategic adaptation to changed circumstances. When the morning sessions concluded, attendees dispersed into collaborative workshop groups focused on specific implementation challenges. The summit design intentionally mixed participants across institutional boundaries, creating connections between specialists who rarely engage directly in traditional research structures. This deliberate boundary crossing generated energy, evident in animated discussions throughout the Innovation Center's collaborative spaces. I was reviewing assessment notes with Catherine Phillips, our grants director, when Thomas approached our table in the networking area. His manner maintained appropriate professional boundaries while indicating desire for substantive conversation rather than merely obligatory acknowledgement. Chairperson James, the Foundation's evolved summit format has created remarkable engagement across traditional barriers, he observed, his tone reflecting genuine appreciation rather than performative compliance. Particularly the integration of implementation specialists within research planning discussions rather than separate application conversations. The participant feedback supports your observation, I acknowledged, indicating the assessment metrics Catherine had compiled from morning session evaluations. Collaboration across traditional boundaries consistently receives highest engagement ratings from diverse participant categories. Our team has prepared a supplementary report documenting unexpected benefits from our restructuring implementation, he continued, presenting a professionally bound document with the Lawson Center's updated metrics, particularly regarding how Patient advisory integration has identified efficiency opportunities previously invisible from researcher perspective alone. We thought the findings might inform the Foundation's ongoing framework evolution. The report represented contribution beyond compliance requirements, not merely documenting mandated restructuring, but actively advancing the knowledge base supporting patient-centered research methodology. This generative engagement suggested evolution beyond strategic accommodation into authentic commitment to transformed approach. The Foundation appreciates this contribution to evolving best practices, I replied, accepting the document with professional acknowledgement. The upcoming funding cycle will emphasize knowledge sharing across institutions implementing similar transformations. Our exchange maintained careful professional boundaries, focused entirely on measurable outcomes and institutional evolution rather than personal history. Yet beneath this appropriate restraint existed undeniable acknowledgement of extraordinary transformation, not just in research methodology, but in fundamental perspective regarding what constituted meaningful success in medical innovation. As Thomas rejoined his team for the afternoon workshops, Catherine observed with characteristic directness, "His evolution appears remarkably comprehensive for someone who initially restructured out of financial necessity rather than philosophical conviction." Authentic transformation often begins with external pressure before developing internal commitment, I noted, the observation applying to institutional evolution broadly, rather than Thomas specifically. The Foundation's funding leverage creates initial compliance that enables experience with transformed approaches, which then generates evidence-based conversion when benefits become tangible rather than theoretical. Indeed, this pattern had manifested across numerous institutions navigating the Foundation's evolved priorities. Initial strategic adaptation to funding requirements gradually transforming into evidence-based commitment as implemented changes demonstrated benefits beyond anticipated limitations. Thomas's journey reflected this broader pattern while carrying unavoidable personal significance given our history. As the summit continued throughout the afternoon, I participated in various workshop discussions, observing the ripple effects of the Foundation's transformed priorities extending throughout the medical research ecosystem. Institutions previously resistant to patient-centered accountability now engaged productively with implementation specialists. Researchers traditionally focused exclusively on methodological questions now explored creative solutions to accessibility barriers. Implementation. Experts previously relegated to separate applied science domains now contributed directly to research design decisions. This expansive transformation extended far beyond any individual relationship or institution, creating systematic evolution in how medical research connected to human benefit. The Foundation's evolved priorities had catalyzed recalibration throughout the research landscape, generating momentum that would continue reshaping priorities long after any particular funding decision. During the summit's closing reception, I found myself momentarily alone on the Innovation Center's terrace, taking a brief respite from the continuous engagement the chairperson role required. The sunset cast golden light across the city skyline, illuminating both historic landmarks and emerging structures in equal measure. A visual metaphor for the medical research landscape's evolution balancing established knowledge with transformative innovation. "Remarkable view," Harrison commented, joining me at the railing. "Both the literal cityscape and the metaphorical landscape you've helped reshape through the Foundation's evolution. The transformation extends far beyond any individual contribution." I observed, genuine appreciation for the collective progress tempering any personal pride in my role catalyzing these changes. "Yet your specific perspective proved essential catalyst," Harrison countered thoughtfully. "The Foundation needed leadership from someone who understood both financial structures and patient experience, someone whose personal journey through medical challenge created clarity about systemic priorities requiring recalibration." His observation acknowledged the unique value my particular pathway had brought to the Foundation's evolution, how my experience as patient navigating experimental Treatment had created insights inaccessible from traditional leadership perspectives. What had initially seemed devastating limitation had ultimately generated distinctive contribution no conventional pathway could have produced. The summit participation demonstrates extraordinary momentum beyond initial resistance, Harrison continued, gesturing toward the engaged attendees visible through the glass walls. Research institutions that initially restructured from funding necessity now advocate for patient-centered approaches with genuine conviction based on implementation evidence. The evolution has become self-sustaining beyond the Foundation's direct influence. He was right. The transformation had developed momentum transcending any individual institution or funding relationship. Researchers were sharing implementation acceleration strategies across competitive boundaries. Patient advisory integration had become expected methodology rather than revolutionary disruption. Implementation specialists had secured legitimate voice in research priority conversations previously closed to their perspective. This expansive systemic evolution represented success far more meaningful than any personal vindication could provide, creating transformation that would benefit countless patients navigating medical challenges long after any individual career or institution had faded from relevance. As the reception concluded and attendees departed with new connections and collaborative possibilities, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this pivotal role. The diagnosis that had once seemed devastating limitation had ultimately created unique perspective, essential for catalyzing necessary transformation. The abandoned spouse navigating recovery alone had become the Foundation chairperson reshaping how medical research served patient needs. The symmetry contained undeniable poetic dimension, but its significance extended far beyond personal narrative into systematic impact that would touch lives I would never know through pathways I could never fully trace. That expansive ripple effect represented the most meaningful measure of successful transformation, not in personal vindication, but in collective evolution toward more humane and effective medical research serving those who needed it most. Autumn painted Central Park in vibrant hues of amber and crimson as I made my way along the winding path toward Bethesda Terrace. The morning air carried the crisp promise of change, appropriate atmosphere for the conversation awaiting me. Thomas had requested this meeting through formal communication channels, his message precisely worded to maintain professional boundaries while indicating the subject extended beyond our official Foundation grantee relationship. The Neuroscience Innovation Conference has invited the Lawson Center to present our institutional transformation as keynote case study, his message had explained. Given the Foundation's catalytic role in our restructuring, I believe collaborative presentation would provide comprehensive perspective valuable to the broader research community. Would you consider meeting to discuss potential joint keynote framework? The invitation carried layers of significance beyond its explicit content. The Neuroscience Innovation Conference represented the field's most prestigious gathering, where research direction was substantively influenced for the coming year. Keynote presentation documenting institutional transformation would solidify the patient-centered approach as mainstream methodology rather than peripheral experiment. And collaborative presentation would publicly acknowledge interconnection between personal history and professional evolution in ways we had carefully maintained as separate domains. I arrived at the designated meeting point deliberately early, using the solitary moments to organize my thoughts. Professional collaboration made strategic sense for both the Foundation and the field's evolution. The question wasn't whether joint presentation served institutional purposes, but whether it could be navigated without inappropriate blurring of personal and professional boundaries we had maintained with careful intention. Thomas appeared precisely at the appointed time, his approach along the terrace steps deliberate but unhurried. He carried a slim portfolio and single coffee cup, having apparently remembered my preference for tea, a small detail reflecting attentiveness to personal preference despite our maintained professional distance. Thank you for agreeing to meet outside formal Foundation channels, he greeted me, his tone balancing professional courtesy with acknowledgement of the setting's more personal nature. The terrace seemed appropriate neutral territory for discussion that bridges institutional and individual considerations. The invitation presents interesting possibilities for advancing patient-centered methodology across the field, I replied, establishing professional purpose as primary framework while acknowledging implicit complexity. Joint presentation would demonstrate evolutionary pathways beyond either institution's individual perspective. We settled on a stone bench overlooking the fountain, maintaining appropriate conversational distance while positioning ourselves as colleagues discussing professional collaboration rather than individuals navigating complicated history. The public setting provided both privacy for substantive discussion and built-in boundaries through environmental context. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.